Well, let's talk about the old town of Rogers City today. Now today is July 16th, 1994, and it's the 25th anniversary of the Man on the Moon, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked around on the moon. Where was I 25 years ago? Right here in this very room with Marion, and we watched that performance being described on CBS by Walter Cronkite. What a thrill that was. Well, today we want to talk about some of my remembrances of Rogers City when I was just a youngster. Let's start in probably around the period around 1916 or 17, just before World War I, and through the war years and into the 1920s. In 1917, as I say, that was the year that I started kindergarten. Now, that was the era of the horse and buggy, you remember. We didn't have a car in our house. There were a few cars in town. But our car, I think, came in right after World War I. Now, that was the mode of travel, however. The streets were gravel, sand, and when it rained, a good quality of mud. The horse traffic going by with horse and buggy or horse and wagon, or in the wintertime horse and sleigh was very common. That was the way people traveled. Now, as I mentioned once before, many of the homes in our area, or many of the homes in town for that matter, had a small building in back, which was a horse barn. We had one. Bertram's had one. Down the street, Mr. Osgood had one. Mr. Church, he not only had a horse barn, he had a team of horses. And then across the street, looking downtown from the Westminster Church, the Stone Church, was the McLean residence. They had a big home in the front, and in the back end, there was a horse barn with a team of horses. He was a drayman. Many people in town, or a good number of people, made their town by using their horses in their employment. And there were a good number of people in town that had horses that were rented or they used, and they worked in Michigan Lime. Michigan Lime itself did not own horses, but there were a lot of places down there where they had to have teams for a great variety of work in the quarry and around the yard. And so some people just drove their teams down there every day, and they were paid a rent for the use of the team. I might say in the immediate area there that Osgood had a horse barn. It was a small barn, and however it didn't last as long. I remember they converted it. They converted the horse barn into an ice house. And there were people in town, of course, who had ice houses where they stored a certain amount of ice during the winter to last them through the next summer, and that was used for cooling. It was used for ice boxes. And there were other people that had the same thing. The Yule house next door had a small ice house. And that ice was put up in the wintertime. Most of it came out of Little Lake, or some of it came out of the Big Lake. And it was packed with sawdust. And but I mean, the horse barn was a very common thing. Now, Rogers City at that time, of course, had its main connections. This was before the railroad came in. It was horse and buggy, or horse and boat. And so if you wanted to get around, you had to have a team, or you walked, or you could ride horseback. Now, the railroad that came into Rogers City, the D&M line, was just a spur off the D&M starting about Posen. Now, the D&M line had been built from up north through Bolton and Cathro and Posen, and to Metz and Hawks and Millersburg and Onaway and up to Sheboygan. That line was built in about the mid 1890s, around 1895, 96. My mother said that she, of course, as I described once before, had watched part of that line being built, because almost 3/4 of a mile of that road cut through Grambua property. D&M brought a right-of-way. And Mother said, as of course I described before, that they would go over and watch them build that line. But the line that came into Rogers City came in because of Michigan limestone. Michigan lime needed a track coming in, and so the D&M built the track. They came in alongside of Posen, in between Swan Lake and Little Lake, along the shore, into Michigan Lime property, and from Michigan Lime property, it was extended into Rogers City. And then, of course, but before that, it was by boat. Now, along the shore here in Rogers City in those early days, of course, were a lot of lumber mills. There were maybe 3 or 4 big lumber mills that had been built along the shore, some by the Hemp people, some by the Polk people, some by the Bertrams, some by others that were in that area. And millions and millions of board feet of lumber was brought in from the surrounding area, from Mulkey and from along the shore in Rogers Township, hauled in the wintertime, and tremendous piles of logs accumulated down the docks to be converted into lumber, and some timber itself, big chunks of timber, were also sent. And most of the lumber was processed right here in the mills. A lot of manpower was used in turning those logs into the timber for building homes. And that lumber was put on boats, came into big docks down here along the lake, and there were lumber schooners that came in here on a daily basis, and they hauled that stuff out, and they brought back goods and services and passengers on the way back. Some of them were very well known, some of those boats. There was one boat called the Starkey that I read in a time, in a period of some 20 years, made 600 trips carrying timber to the south, to Detroit, and the other ports going down along the lake. The boats, that was the way to go. I know I told you before that when I got hit by polio about 1913, my parents took me to Toledo by boat. And Mother said that subsequent to that, they made several trips with me to Detroit or to Toledo and sometimes on to Cleveland to see certain doctors. So the town always had a very, very heavy nautical flavor to it. Now, and also, of course, being on the town, a fishery developed. The fish tugs worked out of Rogers City. Just how many, I don't know, but in reading, I gather that probably 6, 7, or 8 different tugs at various times worked out of Rogers City. The fishing was excellent. And there was a big amount of employment involved in that, 4 or 5 men to a boat. And then also there were men that stayed on board because men had to build boxes so that the fish could be shipped and packed. And then, of course, some had to repair nets, some had to make nets. And there was also necessary in the fishing business to have large quantities of ice available so that those fish, when they were brought in, could be cleaned and packed in ice and then shipped out as fast as possible by boat. Now, some of it, of course, before we had the rail line that came in here, was packed, put on wagons or other conveyances by horse, and it was taken to the railroad tracks that ran through Metz and Hawks. There was put on the trains and rushed south as fast as possible before the ice melted that surrounded. Now, these little boxes of fish held probably 50 pounds of fish apiece. Fish were packed in crushed ice. The ice came out of Little Lake, where there was a tremendous ice business. The ice was put up on great big ice storage bins along the lake. Now, a little lake was located just south of the plant. It was a small lake, clear lake, very, very clean, no cottages around it, and it was spring-fed. And they cut ice there practically all winter long and put it up in large storage sheds. The ice was kept from melting by having sawdust around it. And these great big storage bins, probably 50 by 100, 20 feet high, came up along the shore. And teams and men worked down there, cutting the ice into chunks, and through a process, using the horses, they skidded that stuff up, put it into piles, covered it, and that was the ice that was later brought into town and used for packing fish. It was also used in the ice boxes. Now, I'll explain that probably a little later. We didn't happen to have an ice box at our place. Our food was cooled by cold water that came out of the flowing well in the basement. We had a flowing well cooler, a water cooler, and there were a few people in town that had that same thing. But nevertheless, the fishing was big, big business. And the fish that were caught were just like they are now. There were lake trout, there was whitefish, there were chubs, there were herring, there was perch, and in certain seasons of the year, also suckers were very, very, very heavy demand. And we ate a lot of fish at our house. Wasn't all common. I remember many times Mother would say, well, take the bike, here's $1, and go down and get some fish. Well, for $1, you could get about a 5-pound trout right off the lake. Well, that trout, of course, 5-pound trout would come back. We'd have fresh trout for dinner, and then the next day we would have fish soup. And but we had a lot of that. And Mother and Dad every fall would put up a 10-pound or a 10-gallon crock of fish. Fish was put up in salt brine, and we used it during the winter. When you wanted fish, the fillets were taken out, they were freshened with water, and then became fried fish, soup, and it was excellent. Now, another characteristic of town before 1920, not only here but other places in the country, were the saloons. Saloons where they sold whiskey and beer. Now, today we call them beer gardens. There were, at one time or other, according to the way I read it, must have been 7 or 8 saloons in Rogers City where people went in to have a beer. Now, and of course, that was, they were made primarily for the lumberjacks who would come in and have big weekends. Now, there's one characteristic of how the old saloons were different from modern beer garden or lounge or tavern, as we call it today, or bar, in that ordinarily you didn't find women in those places. Or if you did find a woman in there, she was probably an employee, or maybe she was part of the ownership. Or if she did come in, she came in through a side door or the back door. But women did not come in through the front door of a saloon. That was just part and parcel of the way it worked in those days. That was not, a lady did not enter the saloon by way of the front door. So, but those saloons, of course, as such, lasted until January 1st, 1920. Now, what happened there was that during the period of the war and shortly thereafter, the nation got an idea that they wanted to eliminate the use of alcohol in this country for drinking purposes, for beverage purposes. So they passed the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This actually went through. And as of January 1st, 1920, the bars closed, the saloons closed, the breweries went out of business, and many of the distilleries went out of business. It created quite an economic problem for many, many people, a lot of unemployment. But it also created a problem which was unexpected. It created a tremendous economic, social, political, and criminal problem in this country, the manufacture and sale of illegal alcohol. became the period of the home brew. It became the period of the moonshiner. It was what we call the Prohibition era. It brought on the period of the purple gangs in Detroit, of Al Capone in Chicago, and the illegal manufacture and sale of alcohol. It got so bad and so hard to enforce in any manner, way, shape, or form that come 1933, it was again put up to a vote of the people, and the people repealed the 18th Amendment by way of the 20th Amendment. And the beer came back. And instead of calling it saloons, they called it beer gardens. During the time that I was in high school, and up through the first, until I was a senior in college, it was dry. In the senior year, it went wet, and the beer was back. I remember in Rogers City, the first time that, of course, you had to be 21 at that time, too. You had to be 21 to go into the beer gardens. The first time that I went in with Dad. We went into a little beer garden called the Lemire Brothers. There was Pete Lemire, and there was Leo, and there was Feen. They had a little beer garden, which was located just about where the Dalquist store is now. Very, very close into that area there. Yeah, where the Dalquist store is. And there had been a jewelry store along in that area and a barber shop. The Koch people had a variety store. Thomas had a variety store, very close to the big Bertram building on the corner. And I remember that Dad and I went in and ordered a bottle of Stroh's. That was my first experience in legal drinking and legally sold. Would have had it before, but I mean, this was the way it was in those days. Now, as I recall, along the main street town, this was, there were quite a few places in town that started in 1911, and there was a tremendous demand for workers. And, of course, these people were brought in from all over. Manpower was very, very heavy in the early days of Michigan Line. I read recently where probably around 1920, 1920, there were 1,300 employees at Michigan Line, men. Today there are 250. I checked that out the other day from people at the plant itself. It gives you an idea what has happened at Michigan Line. Now they still get out a lot of stuff, but all the equipment down there nowadays, by comparison to our era, is big, 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 big. The boats that used to come in down there, you remember, they were 300, 400, 500, 600 footers. Today, the big boats, they're 1,000 footers, 1,100 footers, 1,200 footers. They carry the same crew of 25 to 30 men, but they carry 3 times as much stone. We no longer have the tugs. Remember, we used to have 3 or 4 tugs down there in the tug harbor that assisted boats coming in from the outside. We don't have any tugs at all anymore. Every boat had worked on 3 ships. Probably 25 men employed on the tugs down there. No problem about it at all. Now these boats are equipped with thrusters. They turn themselves around just on a dime. They come in, turn themselves around, back into the slips, get a load, and away they go. The big, big shovels that we had in the quarry, and the railroad lines and the dinky cars, the engineers that we had in the quarry, no longer there. They're gone. They don't use them anymore. The big shovels sit on the side, and great big front-end loaders do that work, equipped on rubber tires. Instead of having railroad cars, they have individual trucks that'll carry 150 ton at a time on tires. They bring it in, dump it into the crusher just like they did years ago, And with the crew that they have today of 250 men down there to work at the plant, they get out just as much stone as they possibly can sell. Now, they don't sell as much stone as they used to because the demand for American steel is not there. Foreign steel is that much cheaper. And, of course, we've got more quarries operating than they did at that time. Today we have a very active quarry just south here by Alpena called Rockport. And we have a very, very active quarry just across the street called Cedarville. But the town is different. The town is entirely different. When I left as the superintendent in 1973, we had some 1,530 kids in the public schools. This is the public schools only. Today they have 950. At that time we had 62 teachers, now they got 40. So the enrollment is down. The number of people living in the community is down because the demand for the product which this community had is down. But at that time, going back there to 1911, 12, 13, and up to 20, when the town was young, there were tremendous demand for places for room and board. There weren't enough homes in town. And so there were places where men could get room and board. There was the old International Hotel, which is still there today. That's where Dad came when he came to town in 1907. He stayed at the International. There was the Kitchen House, great big room and boarding place. There was the Central House, which was across from the old Star Theater. That was room and board. And there was the Bayview Hotel down across from Greeka's. There was the Ranke House along Main Street. And at the plant itself was the Smith Boarding House. These places all took care of a certain number of men who came in to work. Of course, they couldn't bring their families until later on when they built enough homes in the community for these people to bring their families. Now, there's still some of the same buildings left along Main Street as there were, say, as I remember in 1916, 17, 18, 19, and 20. The Stephan building that you recall, Weller Zagorski's, where Weller Zagorski had his plumbing shop, that was the Stephan building. There was little buildings along in there, and Mr. Stephan had a shoe shop in there, a haberdashery. For a while that place served as a saloon, and the corner, which was a little meat market there for Weller, for Platts at one time, later became a dry cleaning establishment. Now Dennis has got his office in there, right across from the church on the corner. Then, kitty corner across from the stone church was a building which became Jack's Bakery. That originally was built by Dr. Arscott as a wood shop. Dr. Arscott lived next door in what is called the Wirgo shoe shop. That's where he lived, or that's where he practiced as a young man with his family. And then later on, of course, he built a home right across from A.P. Bertram, the great house that you and I remember. He was a carpenter by trade. And when he came to this community years and years ago, he came as a teacher. Then later went back and became a doctor. Went to a medical school in Canada, I believe. But that's where he had, that house is still there. The old Arscott house serves as a business house. And that's, of course, where his family lived in the back end. Next door to that was the Fleming home. Fred Fleming Sr. Had the hardware store, and his son Fred ran the hardware store after his dad did. That Fleming home is still there, still a private home, right on Main Street. And then next to that was an old ice cream parlor, as I remember it. And then later served Fred McCutcheon as a kind of a general store. Next to that, Adolph Mendy had a tire and gasoline shop. Next to that was another private home. That's where Emil Plath built. That's where the Plath kids were all raised, right there on Main Street, right next door to Plath's Market, where they make that world-famous Plath's loin, which is sold all over the country. It's still made today, shipped all over the country by now United Parcel, even growing bigger every year. Then O'Callahan had a drugstore in there. And back the original O'Callahan drugstore, which is right next door, is where Henry Ewell had his photography shop. And then on the corner was the Heft department store, as you recall. That is now the headquarters for the Prescott County Advance. Now across the street, starting right at the Stone Church, as you remember, when I was a kid, of course, that was a vacant lot. A beautiful stand of pine trees on that lot. And as kids, we used to go in there and smoke. That's where we practiced smoking. By about 1923-24, the Presbyterian Church was built there, a Fieldstone Church. The lot belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Osgood, who lived next door in what was now called the manse for the Presbyterian Church. They donated those lots to the church when it became that they decided to build a church. They donated the lots. Well, across on that corner, of course, we said that's where Dan McLean lived. Next door was the old Chevy garage. I worked there after school on Saturdays during the time that I was in high school. I was kind of a grease monkey there. Washed cars, changed tires, and did a lot of things that a kid would do, 14, 15 years old. Then next to that, there was another private home. Next to that was the Ford garage, where Henry DeVincent plied his trade. He was the Ford dealer there for years. You remember the DeVincent boys used to come over and, well, you wouldn't know that, but Herm would remember it. Well, Herm's gone, so he doesn't. But the DeVincent boys lived where Art Krieger lived later on, over on 4th Street. And then next to that was the Thompson House, another one of those great big boarding houses. And then the rest of that era up there for a long time stayed vacant until Paul Hopp put a gasoline station, a Standard Oil gasoline station on that corner, right across from Hef's department store. I think there were 3 generations of Hopps that operated that. That is still a Standard Oil station today. It's still pumping gas. Then in the next block, on that big corner, was the great big Bertram building. A big red brick building. Business houses on the first floor, and Bertrams lived on the second floor. In the back end of that building, going up along Erie Street, were originally stables, and that's where you remember that Adolph Bertram built the Wonder Bar. He took the old stable and made it into a bar. Next door to that, across the alley, was where Josephson had his general store, Ike Josephson, with apartments upstairs. The next to that was the home of Josephson, and on the corner was the big home, and later on became a gas station. Then across from that is where the Kuhlman building stood. Later on became a mortuary site. Across the street, right in back of the station where, do you remember, as Hop Service Station, was a building right next to the alley, and that was a machine shed. That was run by the Paris people. Paris's repaired all types of metal. They did welding. They did blacksmithing. And the boys followed the dad. Now that's the same family, George, that your friend George Paris, who graduated you, came from. The Paris family were some of the original people who came into this area. They came in at the same time that the Hardises did. And they were originally farm people. They had farmed just out the edge of town, which we later called the Hallbarrow Farm. That was the Paris farm. And they were good friends of the Hardises in the early days. Now I'll get back to downtown. Right next to the alley there, in that same area, there was a building, and that's where the Lemire boys had set up business, the Lemire Taxi. And there was a barber shop as a part of it. A lunchroom was a part of it. And in the back end, there was where you could play a friendly game of poker. And next to that is where Mr. Craig had his photography shop. For years, Mr. Craig was the only photographer, you might say, in the whole county. Many of the pictures that the family has, and many, many families in Presque County from Onaway to Millsburg and Metz-Posen were taken by Craig. He traveled along the D&M line. And you remember the photo that was taken of Mother and Dad's wedding. The photo was by Craig. And the family pictures that we had that were taken during the time that we were in high school were taken by Craig. Now to get back further along that street, the main street. In that area up there, next to the Bertram building, family by the name of family by the name of Koch had a general store there. The Koch lady was a member of the Kirby family. The Kirby family was just across the street where her dad was the mortician. And next to that was Walburn's general store. Next to that was a little harness shop and a barber shop. And next to, going on a little further on the corner, you remember, was a little restaurant with a great big building on the corner where Awada had a 5 and dime store. The back end of that building was where Joe Brooks started his restaurant. And then he built the Brooks Hotel across the street. And during the war, when liquor came back, after a pluck by Charlie and Margaret Heinzel. Teresa remembers that because I think she worked for the Heinzels in the restaurant. And then next door to that, the Schultz building. That's where Mr. Schultz, the baker, put up a great, big, beautiful building. He took half of it, and for the bakery downstairs and his home upstairs. And then the other part of the building became Henry's, where Sam Solomon conducted a men's and a ladies' a shop, clothing store. Sam was a great booster. Now on the bank, of course, on the corner was the Presque Bank where Dad worked. That building had been put up about 1910. The building had been built by P.H. Heft the way he wanted it, and then he turned around because he was president of the bank, he sold it to the bank. But that had that high domed Monticello effect ceiling, as you recall. It was built after an Italian style building, I think in Cleveland, Ohio. Immediately in back of that, going up along Michigan Avenue, was the post office. Then next came Hasenberg's Market. And then across from Hasenberg's Market was the Bradley home, which is now the museum. Getting back the other way, on the next corner, of course, you had the old Lendorf building, which was a hardware store in its day with a home alongside of it. Next to that was where Doherty's have their furniture store. That building was originally built as a bank, the Rogers City Bank. It was going to be a competitor to the Presque Bank. It only lasted a couple of years, and then it was reabsorbed. But getting back to that bank where Dad worked, that building was built in 1910 and served until, I think, 1900 and about 64. When it was torn down, and the new modern bank, which you see there now, was put up at that time. Dad, of course, had retired in 1900 and, I think, 53. Now, it's interesting to note that at the time that that building was torn down, 1964, to make way for the new one. For a period of 1 year, or it's 12 or 16 or months or something like that, the old wooden yellow school became the bank. We had just vacated that because we had built the new school, high school on top of the hill. And so the building was suddenly vacant. The bank needed a place, and so they moved into that old wooden structure. It wasn't a very secure place for a bank, but it worked. The heating system, of course, was still there, and they remodeled the toilet system somewhat, put in some few extra power lines, but of course it wasn't a very safe building as such. But apparently the bank robbers didn't get word of it, or the bandits didn't get word of it, and so it served its purpose well. It wasn't highly publicized. I don't think there are a lot of people didn't even know that it had happened. And so it did its job. Going further down the street then, however, on that corner was the Lendorf building. Then the Citibank building, the Rogers Citibank, and that lasted only a few short years. And then it became at one time it became a A&P store, and then became the headquarters for the Rogers City Power Company, which was later on sold out to Consumers Power. Next to that was the old Rogers City. There were a few bowling alleys in there one time, bowling lines, and a pool room with 6 or 7 tables. Part of it was barber shop, and there was always a friendly game of rum and poker being played there. Then going next was a building which is still there today, Richard's Clothing. That is one of the oldest places in town. Leventhal had his department store there, you remember. That building goes back to 1890. Richard's Clothing, a clothing store, almost looks like Levy's is there today. Then there was another private home, which was also a boarding house, and that was Reinke's. And next to that was where McCrary has their real estate office and their abstract office. And now they're part of the dental office there. But the middle portion of that building was the bank where Dad went to work in 1907. That's still there. The whole darn thing is still there. And then immediately on the corner is the Lark House, or the Lark Building, which you remember as Lark Drugstore. Well, it was originally a general store. And then later on it became a drugstore when Roland became a druggist. The upstairs in 1911 was the headquarters for the telephone company that came in. The telephone company came in about 1911, or about the same time that I was born. The building is still being used today, still serves as a hardware store. And a lot of it on. You go in there and look at the ceiling. It's the same old wooden, or same old metal ceiling that was there when you were a kid, and it was the same ceiling that was there when they built it. Now, immediately across from that whole block, of course, is the Courthouse Square. That courthouse goes back to probably about 1885. And when they went to when the Board of Supervisors decided to build that courthouse there, they had a first. That square, that footage was being used as a cemetery. So they had to move those graves out of there and put them in the new location of the cemetery, which is up along Lark Avenue. I can see the cemetery from where I'm speaking right now. There's 10 acres over here. That was way out in the township, however. This was a township cemetery. If you look at the name on the cemetery, it says Rogers Township Cemetery. This was outside of the city limits. But those graves were moved out of there, and the stumps were pulled out. The old pine stumps that were in there were pulled out. The ground was level, and that's where they built the courthouse. The original courthouse, of course, was all wood, 3 full stories on an attic. The central portion of what's left there today is still the old courthouse. There have been additions put on. There was a new jail that was put on the back end, facing 2nd Street some years ago. And there was another addition that was put on here just a few years ago, facing Erie Street. But the modern portion, the old portion of the old central building is still the old building from years and years ago. Also, I just might mention, somebody asked me some time ago whether they said that they understood that there was a tennis court in that area, and I said there was. The first tennis court that I remember in Rogers City was built on the courthouse grounds in the area facing the lake where the jail is right now. There was a clay court there, and that's where the few people who play tennis did play. Now, going on a little further along Main Street, on the corner of Huron and Erie, you find where as you recall, the Nowitzki meat market. Now that old building is no longer there, but a new Nowitzki was on the same site. That's still there. Now there's a 4th generation of Nowitzkis still operating a meat market there. Immediately adjacent to that, you probably remember a building which served a variety of purposes. Several automobile companies started up in there, and then, as you recall it, it was the Rogers City clothing, where they manufactured clothing. And a large number of women worked there. They manufactured women clothing, the clothing factory. And then there was the home of Morris Kaminsky. Across the street, just past, now across the Lark drugstore, looking further toward the north, on that next corner, was the old Lark home. That was the Denny Lark home on that corner. And then the Lark Avenue comes in there, and then just beyond Lark Avenue, across from the Kaminsky residence, was the livery stable. That's where you could go and rent horses and buggies, or horses and sleighs. I think there were 2 livery stables in town at one time. But I know that Dad used to go and rent a rig there, bring it home on probably a Friday or Saturday evening, put the horse in the horse barn. The next morning we'd start out early, very early, and bring the horse out, hitch up the sleigh or hitch up the buggy, and away we'd go. To go to Grandma's, or to go to Metz, or go to Belknap, or Dad would go fishing, maybe up in the Akiak country. But the livery stable was just that. That's where you hired horses, just like you hire a taxi. Then just beyond that, there had been a saloon, and at one time run by Jack Paradise and his brother. And then there was the rink. As a kid, there was a building called the Rink. That was a huge structure built by the O'Neill family about 1910, and that was a kind of a social structure. They called it a rink because they roller rink there. There was a roller rink, but it was used for dances, and it was the place where they played basketball. That's where the high school teams played before we had the new gym built in 2728. The girls and boys basketball played in that building. There was there was a shower as such, but there was a dressing room, and there was a furnace on each end of the room to heat the place in the wintertime. And it was also used for lectures, used for dances, and it was used for all kinds of public functions that were held at the rink. That served until I think about 1926 when the place burned down. But that was the community hall until the high school was built. That was the largest assembly place that they had for community purposes. Then later on in 27, 28, then of course the school came into being. Now across a